Hello everyone, this is Genuine. We are going to be building an amazing, super simple Saturn Critter Trap farm that doesn't require any endgame materials and is going to give you all the hydrogen you could ever want and then some. And the best part is, it doesn't require any input whatsoever. It's completely free. Alright, so let's get into it. This is incredibly simple, guys. You could put this together in maybe a dozen cycles or less, depending on how many duplicates you have available. So right now we're just going to build out the rough frame. And there is room for modification, just depending on whatever your needs are. And the nice thing about this farm is you can scale this up indefinitely. There's really no limiting factors. You may want to incorporate more pumps depending on just how many plants you have, but I am building this very simple setup for 6 plants, which is going to give you a very generous amount of hydrogen. So here we have our basic outline. It may look a little weird, a little abstract, but there's a good reason for all of this. So this is going to be your main point of entrance. Now I highly recommend before you build your base structure, you make a simple liquid airlock. I recommend using oil and petroleum because you're going to be working with cold temperatures and you don't want to have water that could potentially freeze. Now that we've built our liquid airlock, just for double protection, we can get rid of our bottle emptier and rebuild our structure the way we want it. And then just for an added security measure, I like to just add a manual airlock as well. Okay, so now that we have the base structure up, we're going to want to do some plumbing before we actually put the Saturn Critter Traps in and supply the bee tinies, which are going to be the food source for them. So I highly recommend using radiated gas pipes, and it doesn't really matter the material. There's going to be plenty enough heat transfer, and we're going to control the rate that gas enters and leaves the room with automation. So it really doesn't matter what kind of insulated pipe you have, unless if you're building this in an extremely hot environment and not using insulated tiles, which I strongly don't recommend. Okay, again, it really doesn't matter what material you use. I did this with copper and it worked more than fine for my applications. We are going to be taking advantage of pip planting because Saturn Critter Traps are going to produce the same amount of hydrogen regardless of whether they're wild or domesticated. But if we plant them wildly, then you don't have to supply polluted water, which essentially makes it so that this farm has no input and you're getting free hydrogen. You're just taking advantage of the natural wildlife. So we're going to want to use metal natural tiles to plant our Saturn Critter Traps to take advantage of the heat transfer between the radiant pipes and the copper tiles. If you don't know how to make natural metal tiles, all you have to do is surround an airlock in this configuration and then have a duplicate deconstruct it. And then what you'll be left with is a single tile of whatever metal that you use to construct that airlock. This is a great, easy way to make natural tiles early on in the game. If you want to see a faster and inexpensive way to make natural tiles, check out my video on the best methods to make natural tiles using glass. It's pretty insane. So we'll have our duplicate finish up this last natural tile. There we go. So now we have all of our natural tiles in place, all of our piping done. Next thing to do is introduce the pips. So while our duplicates are wrangling a pip and bringing it over to our farm, we're going to put ladders on the copper tiles that we don't want the pips to plant on first. And we need the pips to plant from left to right using this 3 tile spacing. That is going to let us plant the maximum amount of plants in the minimum amount of space. So Mary's coming in with this pip. And hey, we got our little friend here. Now, of course, we have to supply the seeds. Alright, there we go, 6 Saturn Critter Traps. Again, you can expand this farm using this method as much as you'd like, but we are just doing 6 for now just to show you the basic build. So now what you want to do to make it easier for the pip to pick up the seeds is click on your storage bin, unselect the seed, and then they'll drop on the ground. Now just give it a couple of cycles and the pip should get to work planting. There we go, we have our first seed planted just like that. Okay, now, oh, don't eat it, please don't eat the pip, don't eat the pip. But once you've planted the first Saturn Critter Trap, then deconstruct the ladder, and then continue going down the row. Okay, once you have all of your Saturn Critter Traps planted, now it's time to remove the critter drop-off and the storage bin and get rid of that pip. Okay, so before we introduce the bee tinies and get hydrogen start pumping through here, we're going to want to do some ventilation. So a simple gas pump should give you more than enough for this setup with 6 plants. In fact, I think this gas pump would be able to support maybe up to 20 plants or so, but at that point you may want to just introduce a second pump to make it a little bit easier. And you'd be producing so much hydrogen at that point that the minuscule amount of electricity that they use would be completely negligible. Here's a quick tip: if you want to make an infinite gas storage, you can just put a high pressure gas vent submerged with a little bit of oil, and you do want to have 2 tiles of oil because I find that you run the risk of accidentally deleting the oil if you have more than 1 gas in there. So back at our pump, we are going to have an automation switch with an Atmos sensor because we just don't want to have this pump running constantly for no reason. I'm going to set this to 500 grams or above, so that way your gas pump will never be pumping less than its optimal amount. And so as far as I know, there's no limit to how much hydrogen you can store in this room, and you could just have this room store all of your hydrogen until you need to pump it out elsewhere. But for me, I'm going to pump it to an infinite storage, so I'm setting an Atmos sensor at 500 grams. Okay, so that's actually it for the farm. All you need to do is supply a little bit of cooling, so that way it maintains the temperature of your farm within the plant's livable range. You may have to run whatever cooling system you have for a long period of time depending on where you build this and what its starting temperature is. But let me just show you a very simple way to cool this room. Okay, so let's talk about cooling this room because it's going to be important. The hydrogen that the plants produce are a couple degrees warmer than the plant's internal temperature. So what I'm going to do is place a thermal regulator and connect it to this line that we installed before putting down our natural tiles. Now we do want to have a good amount of heat exchange, so we're going to put some temp shift plates on the back side of it. It doesn't matter the material, you just need to have some kind of temp shift plate. Now you can plug in the hydrogen that you produce from this farm into any kind of system, any kind of power system that you already have. Maybe you already have SPOMs and hydrogen generators, but I'm just going to show you a very simple way to hook this up so that way it's completely self-sufficient and you can have it as its own isolated little farm, even if you don't have any way that you're producing power already. So we're going to build a very simple recirc line for our hydrogen generator, a smart battery to help regulate it, and a storage tank, just in case if you're storing your gas inside of your farm itself, you want to still have a little bit of storage in reserve. I'm just using insulated pipes. You can use normal pipes for this if you'd like. Throw a gas bridge here, so that way hydrogen is first directed to the generator, and then any excess is sent to the storage bin. And then again, I'm adding a recirc line from the storage bin back to the generator so that you'll never be without hydrogen. And then we're going to want to add some automation to the smart battery just so that way it regulates when the generator is running. We're not going to be burning excess hydrogen for no reason. Alright, now you can connect all these machines with just a normal wire. Now that we have everything set up, we do want to make sure the thermal regulator isn't running constantly, and we need to make sure it's cooled. So we're going to set an automation line from the thermal generator to the pipe, to the radiant pipe, and then we are just going to make sure that the temperature of the pipe is maintained so that the way the plants are far from being overheated. So we're just going to add a gas pipe thermal sensor right here. I'm going to set this to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That way the Saturn Critter Traps are well within their comfortable range. I believe that's about -9 degrees Celsius, thereabouts. We do want some cooling for the thermal regulator. So I'm going to be using radiant pipes just to transfer heat to these temp shift plates, which will cool the machine itself. This is just a very simple method to set up a cooling system, and you are going to need to have some external source of coolant. This could be an aquathermal nullifier, this could be an aqua tuner that you might already have set up for cooling your base, it could just be a body of water under a geyser, it doesn't really matter. I'm just using a simple body of water to supply cooling. Again, this is a thermal regulator, so it doesn't have quite as much heat output as an aqua tuner, which generates an enormous amount of heat, so you just need a very small amount of cooling effect. Of course, you would need something more long term, but by the time that it becomes an issue, hopefully you've already got some solutions to cooling your base. So I'm going to clear my room of oxygen by connecting the pump to the thermal regulator just to use oxygen as the cooling gas. It doesn't really matter what you use. You could use hydrogen, you could use oxygen, you could probably use carbon dioxide, but you do run the risk of that becoming a liquid. So I'm just going to pump out all the oxygen in the room and saturate this line. Okay, so there we go. We have a perfect vacuum in our room, which is fine for the Saturn Critter Trap plants. Even though the Wikipedia suggests that they do need to survive in an atmosphere, they actually don't. You could have these on the surface. You could actually have this on the surface exposed to space if you wanted to. So now that we've vented that, we are going to separate this, and then you would have a duplicate destroy your exhaust line or wherever you sent the oxygen. Now we have a cooling loop. We want to make sure that this is working correctly. So it'll send a red signal if we are above 15 degrees. We are very well below 15 degrees, and this is why you want to build a room out of insulated tile, preferably ceramic, but honestly, the heat transfer rate, you're not dealing with super extreme temperatures, so just normal insulated tile should just do fine. So after we did all that effort in supplying oxygen to our cooling line and drawing a vacuum, we are going to finally connect the gas pump to the hydrogen generator and the storage tank. Okay, now after all of that, we can finally put a critter drop off in this first room, and this explains why we need this pneumatic door here. So we are going to select bee tinies. Okay, so our duplicate just dropped off our bee tiny. Now you do want to demolish this critter drop off because it could affect how the hive spawns, and we want it to spawn where it's actually going to be producing bees. So we'll demolish this critter drop off. So now all you need to make a beta hive is one bee tiny that cannot return to a hive. So it doesn't matter how you do it, you just need to separate a bee tiny from a hive. It needs to specifically be a bee tiny, not a beta. It's doing this gross little like fungus thing where it's starting to grow a beehive out of its back. I've never seen it. I've never seen the in-between stages before. That is disgusting. Look at that. What the fuck? Leave it to Clay to make something like that. Okay, there we go. And we have our first bee tiny. I'm sorry, buddy. I know your ancestors made this hive and you came so far. We are going to pop open this door and then wait for it to walk into the center. And there it goes. Okay. So there you go. That is the entire farm. Now, so bee tiny spawn every 1 cycle. So it does take 6 cycles for you to get this farm started, or as many plants as you have. Technically, since bee tiny spawn every cycle, and these plants last 120 cycles before they need to eat another land critter, you could technically have up to 120 plants on one beta hive. Could bee tinies actually travel that big of a distance? Probably not. So you'd want to incorporate more farms if you somehow manage to find that many Saturn critter traps. It's most likely that you have about 20 on your seed tops. So one beta hive should be more than enough to supply all of your Saturn critter traps that you spawn with on any given planet. Again, I just want to emphasize how much I recommend using the pit planting to have wild Saturn critter traps, because if you don't, you have to supply 10 kilograms of polluted water every single day, and that is an excessive amount of water. I've removed the external power source, which we needed to get this farm up and running, and this farm will be self-sufficient forever. Of course, you don't need to have the hydrogen generator sitting right here next to the farm. I just wanted to show you one condensed, consolidated build. Ideally, you'd probably just pipe your hydrogen to your power generation room or splice into a SPOM or anything. If you have an anti-thermal nullifier on your world, I highly recommend powering it with this farm, because then it'll completely remove the heat. This is such an amazing farm that I'm kind of beating myself up over the fact that I never built it before. I mean, the bee tinies don't cost you anything. The Saturn critter traps eat the bee tiny, and then it powers itself because it produces such a massive amount of hydrogen. I mean, let's just take a look. This farm has only been going for 7 cycles since the first bee tiny was eaten by this first plant, and we already have 10 kilograms of hydrogen flooded this entire farm. Give it a couple more cycles, give it 20 cycles, give it 100 cycles, or double the amount of Saturn critter traps you have in here, and you are going to have such an excessive amount of hydrogen with no time at all. It is absolutely insane. It is so simple. Highly recommend it.